The Gospels. Beautiful stories about the life, ministry, and resurrection of Jesus. They have permeated culture and religious thought for nearly 2,000 years. Often from fundamentalists, I hear that these are first-hand accounts of what happened. Of course, they contain many contradictions, some of which can be reconciled and others which cannot. This video will be addressed to the people who think the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses. I've often said in videos that nothing about these books shouts eyewitness testimony, but none of those videos were really about that. So today, that is the question I will be exploring. Are the Gospels eyewitness accounts, and how do we know? First, we can look at the internal evidence for these claims. Maybe these are written by eyewitnesses and scholarship has just been wrong this whole time. People aren't perfect, so that's possible. But let's take a look at each gospel separately and together. Then we'll take a look at the patristic evidence and come to a reasonable conclusion on whether or not the Gospels were actually written by people who saw these events transpire. The first thing to notice is that none of them actually claim to be eyewitnesses. There are allusions in a couple of them that hint at how they received their information, but that's beside the point. The Gospel writers did not claim to be eyewitnesses. They also don't even read like eyewitness testimony. There are simply too many phrases and narrative tools that suggest non-first-hand authorship. In addition to that, none of the Gospel accounts even tell us who the author is. They are never explicitly identified. Our best manuscripts of these Gospels contain the word kata in the title, meaning according to. This is not something we find in first-hand accounts of anything at the time. According to signifies later authorship. Let's begin with what was probably the first Gospel to be written, the Gospel of Mark. Perhaps it will help to figure out when this book was written. In Mark 13, Jesus mentions the upcoming destruction of the temple. For historians, this is a clear hint to show that Mark was written after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. There are many people that will say this is proof of prophecy, but this is fallacious. It's special pleading. If we can accept prophetic claims from Christianity and Judaism, then we should logically accept them from Muslims, heathens, and Hindus. I'm sure the people claiming this is proof of prophecy wouldn't appreciate that. The other problem is that historians have no way of evaluating prophecy claims, or, for that matter, miraculous claims of any kind. We can solve anything with magic and come up with any answer we want. That's not how history is done. The Gospel of Mark may also have been written about 5 years later when Josephus published his Jewish War. In my video, Josephus on Jesus, I outlined the immense parallels between Jesus ben Ananias and Jesus of Nazareth in the temple narrative. Jesus ben Ananias was a prophet in the 60s who was famous for prophesying the destruction of the temple. Josephus briefly covered him in Jewish War, and the story is eerily similar to Mark's temple narrative. It's unclear if Mark had also heard about this Jesus independently, or if he learned about him from Josephus. Both are possible. I think it's likely this gospel was written between 70 and 75 AD. Who are people talking about when they say the author is Mark? Traditionally, this is John Mark, the Apostle Peter's interpreter. Is it possible that Mark wrote this in his old age? Sure, but the evidence speaks against it. If Mark received his gospel from Peter, why is it that the other gospels have more anecdotes about Peter, including, for example, Jesus telling him, "You are Peter the rock, and upon this rock I will build my church"? Would Peter himself forget such an incident? I doubt it. The next gospel to be written was probably the Gospel of Matthew. Traditionally, this is viewed as being written by Matthew Levi, a tax collector and one of Jesus' 12 disciples. Scholars have known for a long time that Matthew was just a rewrite of Mark. The Gospel contains entire paragraphs copying Mark's Greek verbatim. That's no accident. Matthew's Gospel is also written completely in the third person, about what they, Jesus and the disciples, were doing, never about what we, Jesus and the rest of us, were doing. Even when this Gospel narrates the events of Matthew being called to become a disciple, it talks about him, not about me. Just take a look at Matthew 9:9. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. There's not a thing here that would make you suspect the author is talking about himself. This gospel probably came some 10 years after Mark and was certainly not written by an eyewitness. The next gospel, probably written in the mid to late 90s AD, is the Gospel of Luke. Luke is supposedly a companion of Paul. From the very beginning, it should be abundantly clear that the author of this is not Luke. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Luke 1:1-2. If you didn't catch that, the author is telling you that he is writing long after these events, and he is recording the information that has been passed down to him. There has been much debate over the authorship of the Gospel of John, but I think the answer should be clear. This book is also not from an eyewitness. Traditionally, this is viewed as being from the hand of John, son of Zebedee, one of Jesus' disciples. John was seen as the beloved one, or the one who Jesus loved, but this qualifier gives us the information we need to conclude he didn't write this gospel. At the end of the gospel, the author says of the beloved disciple, "This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them, and we know that his testimony is true." John 21:24. Note how the author differentiates between his source of information, the disciple who testifies, and himself. We know that his testimony is true. This author is not the disciple. He claims to have gotten some of his information from the disciple. Now we're left with the big question. Why were these names attributed to the Gospels, and when? Let's begin with some background information. The first thing to note is that until the 2nd century, apostolic authorship wasn't really important. Clement of Rome, for example, knew of Paul's works but didn't bother mentioning Paul as the author. In the 2nd century, any eyewitness would have been dead, and so would everyone they knew. So the church reasoned that they ought to attach names of apostles and companions of apostles to the texts they were using. This can be seen by the rise in texts being written under apostolic names. Until Irenaeus, apostolic authority in the churches was focused on the apostles as a group. It was only in the 2nd century that specific apostles came to be important. The approval of the apostolic literature can be seen by the sheer amount of references and citations to it, not just to the texts that are canonical, but also to the ones that were eventually deemed heretical, including the Gospel of Thomas, the infancy Gospel of James, the Gospel of Peter, the Acts of Paul, and others. In fact, in the 4th century, apostolic authorship was incredibly important. If an apostle wrote a document, it would automatically be accepted as scripture. But the point remains. The authors of the Gospels are not the people whose names are attributed to them. The Gospels were written anonymously and by people who were clearly not eyewitnesses. We just have to deal with that. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe, and check out our new website, MilwaukeeAtheists.com. If you really love us, consider supporting us on Patreon, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter to see what we're up to. We also have an official merch store where you can buy classic Milwaukee Atheist t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, and much more. We'll see you next time.